Margaret Holloway had spent 41 years making sure everyone in her family had what they needed before she ever thought about herself. That was just who she was. Not because someone told her to be that way, not because she read it in a book or heard it in a sermon. It was simply the quiet rhythm of her life, as natural as breathing, as constant as the hum of the old refrigerator in her kitchen that she refused to replace because it still worked just fine. She woke up every morning at 5:30, before the sun had fully decided to show itself, before the neighborhood dogs started their rounds, before the world got loud. She made coffee in the same blue ceramic pot her mother had given her as a wedding gift back in 1983. She sat at the kitchen table by the window that looked out over the backyard garden she had planted with her own hands, and she held the mug with both palms the way people hold things they know are warm and good and might not last forever. The house she sat in was not a large house. It was a 3-bedroom ranch-style home on Clover Street in Denton, Ohio, a place small enough that everyone knew which families had been there long and which ones were just passing through. Margaret's family had been there long. 41 years in that house. She and her late husband, Donald, had bought it for $62,000 in the spring of 1984, and they had poured everything they had into it over the decades. Not just money, though there had been plenty of that poured in too. New roof in 1998. Kitchen remodel in 2004. The back deck Donald built himself over 2 summers with wood he sanded by hand until it was smooth as glass. They had poured time into it, and sweat, and the specific kind of love that shows itself not in grand gestures but in small repairs made without complaint. Donald had passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, which announced itself in October and took him by February, the way that particular disease always seemed to work, fast and cruel and without much room for goodbyes that felt adequate. Margaret had nursed him through every week of it. She had slept in the recliner next to his hospital bed in the living room so she would hear him if he called out in the night. She had learned to administer his medications, learned to read his pain levels by the way he held his jaw, learned to talk to him about ordinary things, the garden, the neighbors, a funny thing she'd seen on the news, so he could feel like a man still connected to the world rather than a man being pulled away from it. After he was gone, she stayed in the house. People suggested she might want something smaller, something easier to maintain, maybe one of those senior living communities where everything was taken care of. Margaret smiled at those suggestions the way she smiled at most things she disagreed with, gently, without argument, and without any intention of changing her mind. This was her house. Every wall in it held something of her life. The pencil marks on the doorframe in the hallway where she and Donald had measured their children's heights every birthday. The slight stain on the living room carpet from the Christmas when her youngest, Kevin, knocked over an entire pitcher of red punch while trying to show off a card trick. The garden, which was all hers, which she had shaped and tended the way an artist tends a canvas, season after season, knowing exactly which corner needed what. She had 2 children. Renee was the older one, 44. Lived about 20 minutes away in a newer subdivision with her husband, Craig, and their twin daughters who were 12 and already exhausting in the specific way that 12-year-old girls can be. Renee was organized and competent and had the kind of energy that sometimes made Margaret tired just watching her. She worked as an office manager for a dental practice, kept a color-coded family calendar, and had strong opinions about everything from nutrition to neighborhood politics. She called Margaret every Sunday evening without fail, and the calls were warm but efficient, always ending with Renee saying she had to get the girls ready for the week. Kevin was the younger one, 39, and he was different from his sister in almost every way. He lived 40 minutes away in a smaller apartment in Columbus, worked in IT for a mid-sized company, and had the kind of quiet, easy manner that made people feel immediately comfortable around him. He came over more often than Renee did, just to sit, just to be there. He'd fix whatever needed fixing without being asked. A leaky faucet, a sticky window, the wobbly leg on the dining room chair that Margaret had been meaning to address for 8 months. He didn't make a production of it. He just did it and then sat down and asked her what she'd been watching lately. Margaret loved both her children. She would have said so plainly and meant every word. But she understood them differently, the way any mother who has paid close attention understands that love for each child lives in a different room inside you, lit differently, furnished differently, meaningful in its own specific way. In the spring of that year, the year everything changed, Margaret turned 72. She felt it, but not in a frightening way. Her knees had developed an opinion about stairs that they hadn't had before. Her hands sometimes stiffened in the early morning in a way that made opening the garden shed difficult. She was slower than she had been, and she accepted that the way she accepted most things, practically, without drama, adjusting her routines to match the new reality of her body. It was during that spring that Renee first brought up the idea. It was a Sunday visit. Renee had come by herself, without Craig or the twins, which was unusual enough that Margaret noticed it. She had brought lunch from a place she liked, fancy sandwiches in cardboard boxes with tissue paper inside, and she set everything up on the kitchen table with the efficiency of someone who is preparing for a conversation they have rehearsed. "Mom," Renee said, after they had eaten most of their lunch and the conversation had wandered comfortably through the twins' school year and Margaret's garden and a neighbor's recent renovation, "Craig and I have been talking." Margaret looked at her daughter over her coffee mug. She didn't say anything. Renee had a particular way of starting sentences like that, "Craig and I have been talking," as though Craig's involvement lent the matter a kind of institutional authority. "We think it might make sense to talk about the house." "What about it?" Margaret said. Renee set down her sandwich and folded her hands on the table in a way that reminded Margaret, oddly, of a loan officer. "You're here alone, Mom. It's a lot of house for one person. The upkeep alone, I mean, you mentioned the gutters last fall. And there's the driveway that needs resurfacing, and—" "The driveway is fine," Margaret said. "Mom. It has cracks. Cracks don't mean it needs to be replaced." Renee took a breath. "We're not saying you need to do anything right now. We're just saying it might be worth thinking about your options. What happens with the house eventually? Because at some point," she paused, choosing her words, "at some point, it becomes a conversation we need to have, and it's better to have it while we can all talk about it calmly." Margaret looked out the window at the garden. The tulips she had planted the previous October were up, red and yellow, standing very straight, looking exactly the way tulips should look in April. "I appreciate you thinking about me," Margaret said, and she meant that part. "But I'm not interested in going anywhere. This is my home." Renee nodded, and the conversation moved on, and Margaret thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Over the next 3 months, the subject came up 4 more times, twice with Renee alone, once with Craig on a Sunday dinner that Margaret had cooked herself because she still could, "Thank you very much," and once in a phone call that lasted 40 minutes and left Margaret sitting very still at the kitchen table afterward, holding her phone in both hands the way she held her coffee mug, trying to understand exactly what was happening. She didn't call Kevin about any of it. Not yet. She wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe because she didn't want to make it a family thing. Maybe because she suspected Kevin would worry, and she didn't want to be worried about. Maybe because some part of her still believed she could handle Renee's concerns the way she'd always handled things, quietly, patiently, until they ran out of momentum. She was wrong about that. And the moment she understood she was wrong was a Tuesday in August, when Renee and Craig arrived together, unexpected, at 11 in the morning, and Craig was carrying a folder. Margaret opened the door and looked at the folder and felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Can we come in?" Renee said. Margaret stepped back from the door. She noticed, in the way she noticed everything, that Renee didn't quite meet her eyes when she walked past. Craig Sutton was not a man Margaret had ever fully trusted, and she understood that was a complicated thing for a mother-in-law to sit with. He wasn't bad to Renee. She would have said that clearly, and meant it. He worked steadily, he was present with the twins in a way some fathers weren't, and he kept the yard of their subdivision home in a condition that was frankly exceptional. But there was something in Craig that had always reminded Margaret of a salesman, not in his work, he worked in finance, but in the way he moved through conversations, the way he always seemed to know where he was trying to get to before the other person did. He sat at her kitchen table now and opened the folder with the ease of someone who had done this many times. And maybe he had. Maybe in his professional life he sat across from people and opened folders and explained things with this same measured voice. He had printed documents. Margaret looked at them without touching them. "Margaret," Craig said, "we've been doing some research, and we want to share it with you because we think it's important." "Research about what?" Margaret said. "About the house, and about your options going forward." He slid a page toward her. The property value on Clover Street has gone up significantly in the last 4 years. We had an informal appraisal done. Margaret's hand went up, not dramatically, just firmly, like a stop sign. You had this house appraised. Craig and Renee exchanged a look. It was fast, practiced seeming, the kind of look that lives between two people who have already talked about how a conversation might go. It wasn't an official appraisal, Renee said quickly. Craig just talked to a friend who does real estate, just to get a sense of the market. This house, Margaret said, is not on the market. Mom, we know that. We're not saying it is. Renee reached across the table and put her hand over Margaret's, and the gesture felt warm, and Margaret hated that she noticed both the warmth of it and the strategy of it at the same time. We're saying that you're sitting on an asset that could give you an incredibly comfortable life. Senior living communities today are nothing like what you're imagining. They're beautiful. Some of them are like resorts. I don't want a resort, Margaret said. I have a garden. You could have a garden there too. Many of them have. Renee. Margaret pulled her hand back gently. I am not selling this house. The room went quiet. Craig looked at the folder. Renee looked at the table. The refrigerator hummed its steady hum, the one Margaret had always found comforting, the one she had refused to replace for exactly that reason. Mom, Renee said, and her voice had changed slightly, gotten quieter, more careful. We're worried about you. Not just practically. We're worried about you being alone here. What if something happened? What if you fell? What if? I take very good care of myself. I know you do. But you're not getting younger, and this house is getting older, and there are real costs coming. The roof is going to need attention in the next few years. You know that, and the HVAC system is original to the. I know my own house, Margaret said. There was another silence. Then Craig cleared his throat, and something about that sound, the measured, preparatory nature of it, made Margaret's spine straighten. Margaret, he said, there's something else we want to bring up, and we want to come at it with love, because that's what this is coming from. He paused. There's a legal instrument called a family trust, which would allow us to manage assets, including real estate, in a way that protects everyone. Renee is your next of kin, and if we set something like this up while you're healthy and clear-minded, it would ensure that the property is handled responsibly and that you're taken care of no matter what happens. Margaret looked at him for a long time. She looked at the folder on her kitchen table. She looked at her daughter, who was looking at the garden through the window. Craig, Margaret said, very slowly, I want to make sure I understand what you're suggesting. You're suggesting that I sign over the management of my home to you and Renee. Not sign over, Craig started. Through a legal mechanism that would give you control over what happens to it. It would protect you. I was not asking a question, Margaret said. Her voice was still calm. It was the calmness of deep water. I was making sure I understood correctly. Craig closed the folder. Renee finally looked at her mother. Her eyes were pink at the corners, and Margaret couldn't tell whether it was guilt or frustration or something else she didn't have a name for yet. Mom, Renee said softly, we love you. I know you do, Margaret said. And I love you. And I want you to take that folder with you when you leave. They left 20 minutes later. Craig carried the folder under his arm. Renee hugged her mother at the door, and the hug was real, long and tight, the way their hugs had always been, and Margaret held on and breathed in her daughter's familiar smell and felt the terrible sadness of loving someone while also watching them do something wrong. That evening, after the sun went down and the garden had gone dark and the kitchen was quiet, Margaret called Kevin. She told him everything. She told him about the spring conversation, and the follow-up calls, and the Sunday with Craig, and today. She didn't editorialize, didn't dramatize, just told it the way it happened, in the same clear steady voice she'd used all day. Kevin was quiet through most of it. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and she knew his silence was not emptiness but the specific kind of listening he did when something mattered. When she finished, he said, Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I thought I could handle it, she said. You did handle it. For today. Another silence. Then, I'm coming over Saturday. Kevin, you don't need to. I know I don't need to, he said. I want to. And Mom, don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. Not until we talk. I'm 72, not 12, she said. He laughed a little. I know you are. She hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the window, which was dark now, which showed her only her own reflection. A small woman in a house that was hers, in a house that would stay hers, in a house that she had bled for in ways her daughter had apparently forgotten or perhaps had never fully understood. And she wondered, sitting there, how much her daughter actually knew about where this house had come from, about what it had cost, about the specific year when everything almost fell apart and Margaret had done something that no one in this family had ever given her full credit for, because she had never asked for credit. Maybe, she thought, it was time for that story to be told. Kevin arrived Saturday morning with coffee from the gas station because that was what he did. He never showed up to anything empty-handed, but he also never overthought the gesture. He set the cups on the kitchen table and sat down across from his mother and looked at her with the same direct, quiet attention he'd had since he was a boy. He had always been her most observant child. The one who noticed when she was tired before she said so. Who noticed when something was bothering her by the way she washed dishes. They talked for 2 hours. Margaret laid everything out again, more carefully this time, because Kevin asked good questions and she wanted to answer them well. He had written some things in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. Not a lot, just the important parts. Dates. Names. The specific language Craig had used about the family trust. A trust isn't inherently predatory, Kevin said carefully, because he was always careful to be fair. But the way he's going at it, without you initiating it, framing it like it protects you when really it shifts control, that's worth paying attention to. I know what it is, Margaret said. Kevin nodded. He tapped his pen against the notebook. Here's what I want to do. I know a guy who's not a lawyer. Well, he is a lawyer, but he's not, expensive. He helped my coworker with her mother's estate. I want you to talk to him before anything else happens. Kevin. Just talk to him. You don't have to do anything. Just have someone in your corner who understands this stuff. He looked at her steadily. Because I don't trust that Craig presented this to you the way he'd present it to someone who knew the legal angles. Margaret looked at her coffee cup. She thought about Craig's folder. About the informal appraisal. About the friend in real estate. All those preparations that had happened quietly, over time, while she had been gardening and watching her shows and thinking everyone was simply living their lives. There's something I want to tell you, Margaret said. Kevin looked up. About the house. About how we kept it. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. You were in college when this happened. 1998. 99. You were at Ohio State and you were busy and your father and I didn't want to worry you. Kevin set down his pen. He gave her the kind of attention that meant he understood this was important. Your father lost his job in the spring of 98, Margaret said. The plant in Millbrook closed. They gave him 3 weeks' notice and a severance package that lasted 4 months, and after that there was nothing. He found part-time work by the fall, a delivery route, but it paid a fraction of what he'd been making. She paused. We were behind on the mortgage by the winter. 3 months behind. And the bank, she stopped, breathed. The bank sent a notice in January of 99. We had 60 days. Kevin stared at her. Mom, I never knew any of this. We didn't tell you. Or Renee, either, though she was already out of the house by then and had her own life. We didn't want it to change things for either of you. She said this without self-pity, matter-of-factly, in the voice of someone who made a decision a long time ago and lived with it and considers it settled. I went back to work. I'd been doing part-time bookkeeping but I picked up 2 full-time clients, and I cleaned houses on weekends, 3 different houses, $100 each, every Saturday and Sunday for almost a year. I did that for 11 months. She said this quietly and then let it sit there. Kevin was very still. I made up the back mortgage in 6 months. We kept the house. Your father never really. She paused again, and this time the pause was longer and softer. He never really got back on his feet the way he had been. He found steadier work eventually, but something had gone out of him after the plant closed, and I understood that, I did, and I didn't blame him for it. But the house, from that point on, was mine. Not on paper, not legally, it was still both of ours, but in every practical sense, I kept it. She looked at the window. I planted that garden the summer we almost lost it. As a kind of, I don't know. As a way of saying we're still here. Kevin had not moved. His coffee was in front of him, untouched. Renee doesn't know this, Margaret continued. Not the full picture. She knows your father had a hard spell, but she doesn't know how close we came, or what I did to keep us. I protected her from it. I protected both of you. She looked at her son. And now she's sitting in her house with her husband and his folder, talking about what to do with this house as if it's simply a financial asset, as if it's something that happened to land in my hands through circumstance, and she stopped. Mom, Kevin said. I'm not angry, she said, though her voice had something in it that was adjacent to anger, something older than anger, something that comes from years of absorbing rather than expressing. I'm not angry at Renee. She doesn't know. But I want you to understand what this house is. What it cost. Not in dollars. Kevin picked up his coffee. He held it with both hands, the way his mother held hers, and she noticed that without either of them saying anything about it. Does she need to know? He asked. Yes, Margaret said. I think she does. What happened next happened gradually, the way important things usually do. Kevin spoke with the lawyer. His name was Paul Garrett, and he worked out of a shared office in Denton, a careful and thorough man who wore reading glasses and asked questions that Margaret hadn't thought to ask herself. He explained what a family trust actually entailed, what rights it would strip from her, what decisions she would no longer have the final word on. He used plain language and he didn't talk down to her, and by the end of 2 hours, Margaret felt something she hadn't expected to feel, informed. Sharp. Ready. She asked Paul what she should do. He said the most protective thing she could do was update her own will and establish her own clear estate plan, not one initiated by Renee and Craig, but one she built herself, with her own intentions written clearly into it, with Kevin named as co-executor alongside Renee. You have every right to do this, Paul said. And doing it now, proactively, while you are clearly healthy and competent, creates a record that's very difficult to challenge later. Can it be challenged? Margaret asked. Most things can be challenged, he said. But a clearly documented, independent decision, made without pressure, with independent counsel, that's about as solid as it gets. Margaret thanked him and paid his modest fee from her own checking account and drove home and sat in the garden for a long time before she came inside. She called Renee that evening and asked if she and Craig could come to dinner the following Sunday. Just dinner, she said. Nothing formal. Renee sounded pleased. Relieved, almost, as though she'd been waiting to be asked back in. Should we bring anything? Renee said. Just yourselves, Margaret said. And Kevin will be here too. A brief pause. Oh, okay. Sure, that's great. Margaret said goodnight and hung up and went to bed early and slept better than she had in months, which was interesting, because nothing had been resolved yet. But sometimes simply knowing what you're going to do, simply having decided, is its own kind of rest. She made pot roast. She made pot roast and roasted potatoes and a green bean dish that had been her mother's recipe, and she baked a pie from the rhubarb she'd grown herself along the fence line in the garden. She set the table properly, with the cloth placemats and the good dishes, not the Sunday china, that was for truly formal occasions, but the everyday good dishes that were still handsome, and said this matters without saying this is a performance. Kevin came early and sat in the kitchen while she finished the last of the cooking, and he didn't ask her anything about what she planned to say because he understood she had her own way of doing things. He peeled the potatoes. He was good at sitting in comfortable silence. Renee and Craig arrived exactly on time, which was very Renee. They had brought a bottle of wine and a bunch of flowers, grocery store flowers, which was fine. Margaret liked grocery store flowers. They were honest about what they were. Renee hugged her mother in the doorway and Craig said the house smelled incredible, and Margaret led them to the dining room and they all sat down together like a family having an ordinary Sunday dinner, which was both what it was and what it was not. They ate. The food was good and everyone said so, and the conversation moved easily for a while through the safe zones, the twins' soccer season, a TV series Kevin had been watching, a strange thing that had happened with the neighbor 2 doors down and her new fence. Craig poured wine. Renee had seconds of the green beans, which Margaret noted with quiet satisfaction. It was after the pie, when the plates were half cleared and the evening had settled into that particular after-dinner slowness, that Margaret folded her hands on the table and looked at her daughter. "I want to talk about the house," she said. Renee and Craig exchanged a look. Not the quick practiced one from before, this one was less certain, off balance slightly, because Kevin was there and they weren't sure what his presence signified. "Mom," Renee started, in the careful voice, "we weren't trying to." "I know," Margaret said. "Let me go first. Please." Renee closed her mouth. Craig set down his wine glass. Margaret looked at Renee specifically, not Craig, because this was between her and her daughter. "I want to tell you something that happened when you were 23, she said. "When Kevin was at Ohio State and you were already in your apartment and starting your life with Craig. I want to tell you because I think it's something you deserve to know." She told it. She told it the same way she told Kevin, plainly, without drama, without self-pity. But there was something different about telling it to Renee, something that felt like opening a room that had been locked for a long time. Not because it was shameful but because Margaret had decided, back then, that the lock was an act of protection. Now the protection wasn't needed in the same way. Now the truth was more useful than the shelter. She told Renee about the plant closing, about the 3 months behind on the mortgage, about the 60-day notice from the bank, about cleaning houses on weekends, about the bookkeeping clients, about 11 months of work that had not been part of anyone's family story because Margaret had removed it from the family story deliberately and precisely. Renee said nothing through all of it. Her face went through several things, surprise, and then a deep, struggling sort of reckoning, and then something that looked like pain, the particular pain of understanding that someone you love protected you from something large, that while you were living your ordinary 23-year-old life someone was carrying a weight they never let you see. When Margaret finished, the table was very quiet. The refrigerator could be heard from the kitchen. "Mom," Renee said, and her voice was not the organized, efficient voice. It was something rawer, younger. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Margaret said. "I made sure of that." "Why are you telling me now?" "Because you need to understand what this house is," Margaret said. "It's not an asset. It's not a financial instrument. It's not something to be managed or repositioned. I bled for this house, Renee. Not your father. Not anyone else, me. And I'm not saying that to hurt him or to diminish what he went through, because he went through something terrible, and I understood it. But this house exists because I made it exist during the hardest year of our lives, and I need you to know that before we talk about any folders or any trusts or any appraisals done by a friend in real estate." She said that last part with her eyes on Craig, gently but unmistakably. Craig had the decency to look at the table. Renee's eyes were wet. She pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment and looked at the ceiling the way people do when they're trying to keep themselves from crying in front of others. Then she looked at her mother and said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry that happened and I'm sorry I didn't know." "There's nothing to be sorry for," Margaret said. "But I want you to understand going forward." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She had put it there before dinner deliberately, and set a document on the table. Not a folder full of papers, just one clean document, several pages paper-clipped together. "I've met with a lawyer," she said. "A good one. I've updated my will and established a proper estate plan. Kevin is named co-executor alongside you. The house is in my name alone, as it always has been, and my wishes regarding it are written down clearly and legally." She looked at Renee. "Everything is in order. Everything is taken care of. You do not need to worry about any of this, and you do not need to manage any of it. I have managed it." Kevin had been quiet through all of this. Now he reached over and put his hand briefly on his mother's arm, just for a moment, just to say "I see you," and then he pulled it back. Craig cleared his throat. "Margaret, I want to be clear that our intentions were." "Craig," Margaret said, in the same calm, final voice she'd used in August, "I know what your intentions were. I'm a grown woman and I've been watching people's intentions my entire life. I don't need them explained to me. The table went quiet again. Then Renee did something unexpected. She got up from her chair and came around the table and knelt down beside her mother's chair the way a child kneels and put her arms around her. And Margaret held her daughter and felt her shaking slightly, and she stroked her hair the way she had stroked it when Renee was 7 and had been frightened by something in the night. I love you, Mom, Renee said into her shoulder. I love you too, Margaret said. That was never the question. When they left that evening, Craig was quieter than he'd been when he arrived, and Renee hugged her mother twice at the door. The folder was not mentioned. It would not be mentioned again. Kevin helped Margaret with the dishes. He washed and she dried, and they stood at the kitchen sink together. And outside the window the garden was dark and still. You did good, Kevin said. I just told the truth, she said. That's usually what doing good is, he said. She folded the dish towel and hung it through the oven door handle and looked around her kitchen, her house, her garden through the window, her refrigerator humming its old steady song, and felt something she could only call rightness. Not triumph. Not even relief. Just the solid, anchored feeling of standing exactly where you are supposed to be. She thought she was done. She thought this was the resolution. The conversation had happened, the documents were signed, the truth had been told, and now life would settle back into its rhythm. Kevin would come on weekends. Renee would call on Sundays. The garden would do what gardens do through the seasons, turning and resting and coming back, which was maybe the most reliable thing in her life. But there was one more thing. One more thing that Margaret didn't know about yet, something that had been set in motion quietly, before the Sunday dinner, before Paul Garrett's office, before Kevin's Saturday visit, something that was already in process, already moving toward her, that would arrive not as a threat this time but as a shock of a different kind entirely. It arrived on a Wednesday. A letter, in a plain envelope, with a return address she didn't recognize. A law firm, not Paul's, a different one, in Columbus. And when she opened it and read it standing at the kitchen table in the morning light, with her coffee cooling beside her, her hands went very still. The letter was from a firm called Harwick & Associates, and it was addressed to her formally, which she had not expected, and it referenced a name she had not heard spoken aloud in over 30 years. Gloria Dean. Margaret sat down at the kitchen table. She read the letter again, more slowly, because the first reading had been too fast to make it fully real. Gloria Dean had been her neighbor on Clover Street from 1985 to 1991. She had lived 2 houses down, in the yellow Cape Cod with the wraparound porch, and she and Margaret had been, for those 6 years, genuine friends, the kind of friends made between young mothers in early marriages, the kind knit together from borrowed cups of flour and long afternoons on back porches and watching each other's children so the other one could breathe for an hour. They had been close. And then Gerald Dean had gotten a job offer in Phoenix, and the family had moved, and Margaret and Gloria had exchanged letters for a few years and then phone calls and then Christmas cards and then nothing, the way closeness sometimes simply evaporates under the pressure of distance and time and the ongoing work of living. Margaret had thought of Gloria occasionally over the years, the fond and slightly wistful way you think of a chapter in your life that was good but closed. According to the letter from Harwick & Associates, Gloria Dean had passed away in April of this year. She had lived in Scottsdale, Arizona, and she had been widowed herself and had no living children. Gerald had passed years ago, and their one son had died in an accident in his 30s, which Margaret had not known, and reading that landed on her with a slow, heavy sorrow. Gloria had spent her final years in a care facility where, by all accounts in the letter, she had been well looked after but lonely in the way that people without family are lonely. She had left something to Margaret in her will. Not money, though there was a small sum, $14,000, which the letter described as a bequest of personal gratitude. What Gloria had left, primarily, was a letter. A personal letter, handwritten, which the firm had been instructed to include with the legal notification as a matter of her final wishes. Margaret unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was shaky but legible. The handwriting of a woman whose hands were not what they once were, writing something she wanted to make sure was written. Dear Maggie, it began, using the name no one had called her in 30 years. If you're reading this then I've gone ahead of you, And I hope you'll forgive me for the dramatic presentation, but my lawyer says this is the proper way to do it, and I've never been particularly proper, so at least we're ending on brand." Margaret laughed, a short, sharp sound in the quiet kitchen. She could hear Gloria's voice in every word of it. "I've been thinking about what I wanted to say to you for a long time. Longer than I should have waited, probably. You know how it is. You think you'll pick up the phone and then you don't, and then too much time has gone by and it feels strange, and then more time goes by and it feels even stranger, and then somehow 30 years have passed and you're an old woman in Arizona wondering why you didn't just pick up the phone. I wanted you to know something that I should have said back then. When it happened. You remember the winter of '99? Maybe you do. Maybe you filed it away somewhere because that's what you do, Maggie. You file away the hard things and just keep going, which has always been one of your best and worst qualities." Margaret's hand went still on the page. "I knew about the mortgage," the letter continued. "I knew about Donald losing his job and the bank's letter and all of it. Gerald had heard from someone. You know how small that neighborhood was. And I didn't say anything to you directly because I could see you weren't saying anything to anyone, and I respected that. But I wasn't going to just watch. The second bookkeeping client you picked up that winter, the referral that came through the Donnellys? That was me. I called Patricia Donnelly and told her I knew a woman who was the best bookkeeper I'd ever seen, which was true, and I asked her to pass your name along, which she did. I never told you because I knew you wouldn't like it. I knew you'd feel like I'd interfered, or pitied you, and I hadn't. I'd just seen a capable woman who needed a door to open and I nudged it. I don't know if that second client made the difference. Maybe you would have found it anyway. But I always hoped it helped, and I never got to know for certain, and for 30 years I've carried the question. You were the best neighbor I ever had. The best friend, really. Gerald always said so, and he was right about very few things, so I paid attention when he was. I hope your house is still standing and your garden is still growing and your children know how lucky they are. Love, Gloria." Margaret sat at the kitchen table for a very long time. The morning light moved. The refrigerator hummed. The garden outside was green and thick and full of the particular riot of late summer. Zinnias and black-eyed scissors and the tomatoes she was growing along the southern fence, which had been extraordinary this year, better than any year she could remember. She thought about the winter of '99. She thought about the second client, the Donnelly referral, how it had arrived in November like a rope thrown to someone treading water. She had always thought of herself as the one who had done it alone, pulled herself and Donald and the house through by sheer effort of will. And she had. But there had been a hand she hadn't seen, a quiet nudge from someone who loved her without making it a performance, who helped her without letting the help diminish her. She thought about Kevin, fixing her faucets without being asked. She thought about Paul Garrett, with his reading glasses and his clear explanations. She thought about Renee on her knees beside the chair, and the hug that was real. She thought about how many invisible hands had held her life steady over the years, how many small acts of love had happened without announcement or credit, and how she herself had spent decades doing the same for others without needing anyone to notice. She folded Gloria's letter carefully and held it against her chest for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Kevin. "I need you to come over," she said. "Not urgently, but soon. I have something to show you." "Is everything okay?" he asked immediately. "Everything is more than okay," she said. She paused, looking out at the garden. "I just got a piece of something I didn't know I was missing." She hung up and went out to the garden. She stood in it in her cardigan and her garden shoes, in the late morning light, surrounded by everything she had planted and tended and fought to keep. The tomatoes were extraordinary. The zinnias were going to seed now, which was fine, which was how it worked. The blooming and the seeding and the going quiet and the coming back, over and over, season after season, entirely reliable if you just stayed and gave it what it needed and didn't give up on it during the hard winters. She picked a tomato. She ate it standing right there, warm from the vine, the way she had eaten them every summer since 1984. It tasted exactly the way a tomato should taste when it comes from ground you have known for 40 years. 3 weeks later, Margaret drove to Columbus. She met with Paul Garrett one more time, not because anything was wrong, but because she had an addition she wanted to make to her estate documents. She asked him to include a provision, a specific, legally recorded one, stipulating that the house on Clover Street should not be sold for a period of no less than 5 years following her death, and that during that period it should be made available to any member of the family who wished to live in it or care for it, provided they maintained the garden. "That's an unusual provision," Paul said, not unkindly. "It's an unusual house," Margaret said. He wrote it in. She drove home to Clover Street, and she parked in the cracked driveway that did not need to be replaced, and she walked through the door of the house that was hers, the house she had bled for, the house Gloria had quietly helped her keep, the house that held 41 years of pencil marks and pot roast sundaes and a rhubarb plant along the fence line and the particular hum of a refrigerator that still worked just fine, and she put her keys on the hook by the door, the same hook Donald had installed in 1986, and she thought, "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," and for the first time in a very long time, she believed it without having to argue herself into it.